Hello everybody, welcome back to The Contrarian. For those of you who are new to this channel, my name is Logan. I really like to talk about overall success, investing, and most of all, going against the crowd and looking at trends and opportunities out there that the crowd is ignoring for the most part. If you are a regular watcher of this channel, you'll know that it has been a little while since I've uploaded videos to YouTube. This has to do with how crazy busy the last couple months have been in moving for work, but now that I'm all settled in, I should have a little more time to do videos on a more regular basis, but work is generally more busy now, so I will probably just be limiting my videos to the topics which I think are most worthy of discussing, and today's topic definitely fits into that camp, and that has to do with the long-term trend of all fiat currencies towards their intrinsic value of zero. Right now, there are absolutely zero fiat currencies which are backed by anything with intrinsic value. So as in the past, all things will be in the future. So my forecast is that this will inevitably mean that the dollar at some point in the future has to go through a period of hyperinflation. Now this would seem like a very obvious statement, but today I will really go into the details of how this could likely come about and also some of the early signs that we're actually seeing right now that are leading towards countries both shifting away from using the dollar as their means of exchange, and also how this can affect the dollar in terms of both causing offshore dollars to come back to the United States, and that in turn leading to much higher levels of inflation. So going back roughly about 10 years, we saw the creation of quantitative easing, which hadn't existed before then, and a lot of people at that time thought that quantitative easing would cause massive inflation, and it actually did not lead to inflation because quantitative easing in and of itself is not inflationary. And you know, as much as I like people like Peter Schiff, and I do agree with him on some other things, he has been incorrect with regards to quantitative easing. In regards with quantitative easing, it's simply swapping government treasury bills for commercial bank assets, and in doing that, there is no currency created anywhere in the process that can make its way into the economy. In return for the assets that the Federal Reserve receives, the banks actually cannot use any of the money that they are given. It simply remains in the Federal Reserve, only it is in an account which the banks theoretically own, but they cannot use it directly to give out any loans or anything. So it's a complicated process, but in layman's terms, quantitative easing actually does not cause inflation. Now, since 2019, since the COVID pandemic, we've actually seen different programs put in place which have led to significantly higher inflation, and namely fiscal stimulus, the direct payment to consumers that we've seen, and also the just massive expansion in welfare programs that we have seen. This has led to actually people going out spending the money, and the money actually getting into the economy very quickly, and that has led to inflation, which would be expected. And also we've seen on the supply chain side of the market, we've seen a lot of disruption in the supply chain as a result of shutting everything down during the initial lockdowns and everything. And because China basically has most of our supply chains in its control, there's still a lot of issues to be worked out with regards to that supply chain, and it's questionable as to whether the supply chains as they were back in 2019 will actually need to be reworked. In some cases, it's appearing that China might actually not want to reinstitute the all the factories and everything that they had going back in 2019. Simply put, there's the incentive there for them to use this advantage in terms of you know, benefiting themselves, and they obviously know that we're in a position to suffer potentially if they continue to weaponize the supply chain issue. But that is a separate video entirely. Now today I'm just focusing on the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and how I actually do think that the dollar will eventually go through a period of hyperinflation. Now, in order to get there, we need to get back to the reason as to why the dollar has up until now been very stable. It's been able to avoid hyperinflation or even high levels of inflation, in large part because the United States has been able to offshore or export dollars, and in doing that they've actually caused a lot of inflation elsewhere around the world. We're seeing that with countries like Turkey right now, with Turkish lira in recent months, just seeing that currency really go down immensely in value. Right now actually in Kazakhstan, they're going through the similar issue of the currency there going down in value significantly. And going back years before in Venezuela and other examples such as that, in some of these cases this had to do with the United States essentially exporting their dollars, and the central banks of these foreign countries needing to hold dollars in their central bank in order to conduct exchange meant that the United States was actually able to print money to offshore all of this money, and yet it wouldn't cause inflation in the United States simply because these dollars were not physically here. They were not being spent in the United States economy, but they were in turn causing inflation elsewhere around the world. Now, obviously all of this comes crumbling down when these dollars inevitably make their way back to the United States, and arguably a very telling sign of this right now is that China and Russia, and China, for context, is the world's largest energy importers, so they import most of their energy, and Russia is the world's largest energy exporter. They have a lot of oil and gas reserves, so they export a lot of energy. And China and Russia recently came to an agreement of exchanging oil and natural gas without using the US dollar as the means of exchange. So up until then, both the Russian central bank and the Chinese central bank would have had to hold dollars in their central banks in order to conduct this exchange, and hence why the dollar has been the world's reserve currency. They just had to hold dollar-denominated assets, and also they had to buy large quantities of U.S. Treasury bills. And because of this, the United States was able to issue a large amount of debt simply because there were always the buyers there to receive this debt. There were always buyers there willing to pay for this debt simply because they had to be there because the dollar was the world's reserve currency. But this is a very telling sign in that China and Russia have gotten very creative. They've come up with a mutual, agreed upon way of exchanging oil in such a way that they no longer need to use dollars as a means of exchange. So because of this, they are now able to alter the portfolios in each of their central banks and all of their wealth funds, etc. So looking at this recently announced news, the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum announced that, like the central bank, they have decided to reduce investments of the National Wealth Fund in dollar assets, and instead they are focusing on the euro, the Chinese yuan, and gold assets. So they're actually, in moving to gold, they're actually moving somewhat back to something with intrinsic value. So maybe they're trying to strengthen the Russian ruble a bit there. So that could be a somewhat decent sign that currencies are actually having to compete with each other in terms of getting back to some sort of monetary standard backed by something with intrinsic value. But all of this is just a very telling sign in that for a while now the dollar has been used as a weapon, a financial weapon against countries that the United States has not been favorable towards, and it's been used as a weapon even in situations where the country was simply disagreeing with the United States in terms of trade agreements, in terms of humanitarian rights, etc. And I'm not trying to make a moral statement in terms of, some of these countries probably do need to fix some of their human rights issues, but nevertheless, that has forced the incentive of these other countries to, invent a new way of exchanging these goods and services between each other without using the dollar as their means of exchanging it. And there isn't that much that the United States could, in theory, do. For example, if the Russian and Chinese central bank were to simply come up with a means of exchange for everything, for example, without the United States knowing about it, and then just suddenly announce that they were no longer using the dollar for any of their trade. In theory, that's kind of something that could happen, and that could, in theory, hurt the United States immensely. In that after such an announcement, all of these foreignly held dollars would come flooding back into the United States, and that in turn would just cause a massive spike in inflation, as all of this inflation that we've been able to export to other countries suddenly comes back to roost. So all of this being said, this video is simply to highlight the weakness that the dollar has in terms of, one of its most prominent strengths and characteristics in the last, several decades has been of being used as a financial weapon, but that actually could be used against the United States itself if the countries that the United States has effectively been bullying with this weapon actually team up and begin to try to use it as a weapon against the United States itself. So all of this being said, this is simply why I do think that the United States dollar will inevitably need to come to a reckoning, need to go down in value significantly at some point, even though it technically still is the reserve currency around the world. That title is gradually being eroded. So all this being said, I'm not trying to provide any sort of advice with this video, and this is obviously a very long-term type of forecast. I'm not saying that this will happen in the near term by any means, but if you liked this kind of content, just consider subscribing to this channel, and I hope to see you again at some point.